Welcome to Mott Macdonald. My name's Andy Brock. I'm the Managing Director of Cambridge Education and also a Director of Mott Macdonald, which is the parent company of Cambridge Education. Very pleased to have you here this evening for this event. Mott Macdonald has started hosting events like this recently as part of our response to the Secretary of State's challenge to key suppliers to engage more and provide and show more value for money in the engagement that we have with DFID, and part of that for us is about trying to engage with the communities that we are part of in terms of the education, health and other sectors that we work in for DFID. And so events like this are a way of trying to share experience, to create platforms for reports like the ones we're going to talk about tonight, and to bring people together to debate some of the key topics in the education sector. I think the topic with technology is obviously something which features very strongly at the moment in DFID and with other donors. We ourselves are involved in a number of projects, some of which I think will be referred to tonight, the English in Action project in Bangladesh and the teacher development program in Nigeria, where we are working with DFID and with partners in those countries to use educational technology to improve teaching and learning in particular. And I think particularly the issue of scalability, replicability, which is a challenge which is being thrown out regularly to large programs that DFID and other donors are funding, does create real interest and real necessity to debate what really works, what the evidence is for educational technology. So I'll just finish there, again thanking you for coming. I hope that we have a very interesting discussion and debate tonight, and I'm going to pass over to Sally Gear, who is going to chair the session.
I've got the happy job of welcoming people also on behalf of DFID, but first to say thank you very much Andy and to Mott Macdonald, and I genuinely think these events bring value for money, so thank you for hosting this today for us, and also for Hart, who produced this excellent guide in partnership with DFID, which I think is a real step forward for us as an organisation. It's a really beginning of a journey, so thank you for that. And also thank you for you all for coming. I know some have come further than others, so thank you for coming for this event, and I hope that it lives up to your expectations and we all learn together from it. I'm really just going to kick off and then hand over to Tom to talk about the guide, but I just wanted to start with sort of 3 points. I think the sort of history behind this guide was a growing interest within DFID of the use of educational technology to improve learning outcomes. So this is very much part of our journey moving into learning and quality, and teaching and learning and pedagogy in particular. So that's really the heart of where this journey began. I think the second point to make is UK Aid, DFID, what we're about is helping the poorest. It's about marginalisation. So I think we're particularly interested, and this perhaps is where the value for money questions come up and the scalability questions come up, in how we can use educational technology to improve learning outcomes, but specifically to improve learning outcomes for those who aren't being reached by business as usual. And we all know that there are plenty of children out there who may have been not in school at all. In fact, if they're in school, they may be only marginally attached to a schooling or learning environment. So we have a huge challenge in front of us still, and educational technology, we believe, may well be part of the solution. And I think the third and final thing that I want to say on behalf of DFID is that, yes, we have English in Action, and we also now have the teacher development programme. English in Action particular, great example, being around for a while. But most of our work at the moment is very much around what we would term now in our jargon, the innovation space. So we're still very much piloting, doing new things. And my sort of main day job is working on the Girls' Education Challenge, because my focus area is mainly on gender and education. And within the Girls' Education Challenge, I'm delighted we've got colleagues here who are involved in that. We have 3 strategic partnerships with the private sector looking looking at the use of education technology for marginalised girls. So again, really focusing on our key areas, but these are very much pilot, innovation, evaluation type of approaches. So we will be learning and sharing our knowledge about that as we go ahead. So I just wanted to kick off with those 3 points and to set the scene for a learning journey, which is what today's about. We will have some inputs, but this is also about everyone in the room. So let's hope we'll have a lively discussion and we'll go away a little bit wiser by the end of the evening. So thanks for coming. I'm going to hand over to Tom now. Tom Power, who was very instrumental in producing this guide, and thank you for that. He's got a strong background in leading programs in Bangladesh, in South Africa and in Egypt, amongst many other places. Very particular interest in teaching and learning in classroom-based teacher development and the use of technology in that. But he principally is going to focus on, for us this evening, to talk a little bit about the main findings from the topic guide, so that can kick our discussions off. We are virtually, well, not quite virtually, that's not the right term, we have a video clip from Niall Winters, who was also very involved in producing this guide, so we didn't want to leave him left out, although unfortunately he had to be at another conference this week. So he will also be joining us in a video clip as part of the presentation. So we have 2 out of the, is it 4 people who produced the guide here today? And I'll hand over to you now, Tom, with thanks.
Very much. Well, I'm very happy to be able to be here tonight to share the findings from the educational topic guide that's been produced. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have around that in a little while. That looks the same as the last one. There we go. First of all, when we're talking about educational technology, what are we talking about? The sort of language that's emerging in DFID policy at the moment is up on the screen there: digital or electronic technologies and materials to support teaching and learning. I think if you look at the literature over a period of time, there's a transition from talking primarily about forms of technology to talking more about the educational processes and communities and practices that are involved in the use of that technology for teaching and learning. And the Technology Enhanced Learning Research Group have got the definition on there that it's in technology itself doesn't enhance learning. It depends on how it's designed and implemented, on how teachers are supported to use it, how outcomes are measured, and what communities are in place to support it. So I think when you talk about educational technology, you have to think not just about the technology, but about all those aspects of the wider context of use. Evidence. The guide was produced really to address a perceived gap in the evidence, and this is sort of summed up, but this isn't particularly a development context that we're talking about here. This is from a Journal of Research in Technology Education. It's looking at first world contexts primarily, but even in that context they're saying there's a real difficulty for educational policy makers in terms of making decisions around educational technology and what is helpful and what is not in the use of that, because there's very either inappropriate evidence to guide those decisions, or the evidence that there is may not be presented in ways that are helpful to decision makers. If we sort of look not at the research community but more around sort of donors and policymakers, and in a development context we see similar sort of things reflected. This is the Asian Development Bank review from 2012, and they looked across education systems in Asia and came to the conclusion that actually there's a big emphasis in most of the systems on hardware provision. People talk about the technology and the hardware as if that solves problems by itself. There's not actually an awful lot of emphasis on how that hardware and technology is being used and what kind of contexts make it meaningful. And I think we see in the sort of language of that reflections of the issues that were being raised in the educational technology field. So the purpose of the guide: to contribute to the evidence base that links educational technology and educational outcomes, to appraise the evidence that we can find in current literature, particularly looking at two areas. One's the evidence that the use of technology by teachers affects teaching practice or learning outcomes, and also the use of technology by students, and again looking at their learning practices and learning outcomes. And finally, to try and make some practical recommendations, particularly with the audience of DFID education advisors in mind, as to what kind of things can they do that will help get more effective programs up and running. Oh, okay. Right, we've leapt straight in. We're going to quickly go through the findings, and first of all, we're going to talk about the findings that were around forms of educational technology use by teachers. So this thing where the teacher might be using technology for professional development, they might be using it with students in a classroom, but essentially the teacher's in control of the technology rather than students sort of directly hands-on. And there was a lot of evidence, I'd say the majority of the evidence of impact related to interactive radio instruction. Part of that might be because it's been around for a long time and is well accepted, so there's time to accumulate those evidence. Range of effect sizes on learning outcomes, the World Bank 2005 finding average effects around 0.5. A lot of variation in that from more recent reviews, and I think interestingly the Hohenthal review found that the strongest effects, the IRI was seen to be most effective in terms of improving learning outcomes for very young, getting tongue-tied, very young learners, particularly sort of class 1 and 2, and diminishing effect sizes for older learners. There was lots of evidence about the impact on learning outcomes for IRI. There's actually very little about how that changed the process of learning, what happened in the classroom that was different as a result of IRI. The only two that we could find are here. I'm not going to attempt to translate the Sula from Russia, but it seems a strange project name to me, but that's definitely what it said in the paper. But this was a program in Guinea that, as well as interactive radio instruction, it had face-to-face support meetings for the teachers, and they did qualitative observations of the classroom, and they found two things changed. The first is a very modest change in teacher behaviour. I hope we'd set our heights higher than this. It's about decreased teacher violence. They found teachers hit students less often as a result of the program. But perhaps more importantly, they found that teachers also took time a little bit more. Instead of rushing through the curriculum after the program, they gave more time for students to develop their understanding and think about the ideas that were being presented to them. Another program mentioned in the Hohenthal review was in Mali, and again this wasn't just IRI, but it was IRI in conjunction with teacher development programs, and that I think the radio was used as part of the teacher's INSET as well as for the classroom practice. And they found increased teacher awareness of the techniques that were being promoted by the program, and increased teacher use of those techniques year on year over a number of years that the program was implemented. Now, I know no one's going to be able to read this, don't worry, that's not the point. We've got this graphic here because actually this is one of very, very few examples where there was quantitative evidence of changes in classroom practice. So don't worry about what it says, but the gist of this is the grey bars are year on year, so it's 2005, 2006, 2007. The top set for each of the things, the top set is the teacher's awareness of the pedagogic technique that's being promoted, increasing year on year, and the lower set is on teachers' use of those techniques being observed in the classroom. And that kind of quantitative evidence, how did classroom practice or teachers' understanding change, with some measurable objective indicator associated with that, is extremely rare, and that's why we've put this here. Okay, another example that we found that had lots of evidence of change in classroom practice and learning outcomes was again from the use of audio in the classroom, but this time by mobile phones rather than interactive radio instruction. This is from English in Action, Bangladesh, and there were several studies over a number of years that provide evidence of changes in teachers' perception in classroom practice and learning outcomes. These were large-scale systematic observations of classroom practice repeated in 2011, 12 and 14. Significant increases in the use of the target language English, significant increases in students' talk time from negligible to sort of 20-25%, and increased use of pair and group work being observed in the classroom. Again, very unusual to have quantitative measures of changes in classroom practice. EIA is again one of, I think, 3 examples of that we found. Also, this is unusual in that it has evidence of changes in classroom practice and evidence of changes in learning outcomes, both of which in quantitative form. Very often we find one but not the other. And EIA found 35% more primary students achieving grade 1 or above in the English language competence assessments, and 20% more secondary students achieving grade 2 or above at the end of the intervention compared to before. Another example of teachers using mobile technology in the classroom, this time to present video material rather than audio. This is Bridge IT, a program that used the Nokia education delivery system. 2 studies, one in India, one in Tanzania, looking at mobiles to provide video, and again in the context as ongoing support and professional development for the teachers. It's not just a technology delivery program, but they've got a professional development program. Again, systematic observations of classroom practice. 31% of increase in lessons rated high quality. I couldn't find anything in the literature to unpack that. So what was it that they were observing that meant this was a higher quality lesson than what they'd identified as a delivery? And I looked everywhere and could find nothing that unpacked the nature of the observation that led to that statistic. But it was interesting that it was a quantitative measure again. And again, unusual that they've got both the classroom practice and the learning outcomes. Tanzania gains 10 to 20% over controls in maths and science. In India, gains in science but not English. They were really significant studies because there were very few other examples of teachers' use of IT that we found such evidence of impact. The other one that stands out is the Primer study in Kenya. This is quite complicated. They had 3 groups. They had some groups where students had technology, some form of tablet device themselves, other groups where the teachers but not the students had some form of tablet device, and other groups where the teacher educators had the tablet but not the teachers or the students. What they found was that the teacher or the educator tablets both produced the same levels of change in student learning outcomes, and what they were focusing on was early literacy. I think that very interestingly this paper found that because the teacher's device was more expensive than the students, but you only needed one of them as opposed to lots of them, it cost about 10 times more to give the technology to the students than to the teachers. But giving the technology to the teacher or the teacher educator produced the same learning outcomes. So they concluded that the cost effectiveness of giving educational technology to the teacher was very much higher in their intervention than the cost effectiveness of giving the technology to the students. That was about the only paper in all of the things that we reviewed that addressed the issue of cost effectiveness and linked changes in learning outcomes to the cost of technology and program design. So one of the gaps that we think is that there's a real issue here about understanding more about how you assess cost effectiveness in these kind of programs. Right, computers per se, I'll have to pick up the pace a little bit. Generally speaking, we found lots and lots of papers that found no evidence of any change in teaching practice or learning outcomes from the result of computers. A few standout ones there. There's the first review of 1 laptop per child in Peru. Despite increasing the access to computers tenfold, the program didn't seem to have any effect on the quality of instruction in class, and laptop use was generally directed to activities that had little effect on educational outcomes. That kind of theme was common in many, many papers. Lots of examples that giving children computers absent other things really doesn't make an awful lot of difference, and sometimes even in the context of enormous investment. A couple of examples, 2 or 3 examples where we found a different outcome to that, and they all had features that it was a teacher development program, and it was a focus on promoting project or inquiry-based learning, and it was supported by curriculum resources for the students to use. And they all found more independent or collaborative work, And interestingly, two of the studies there where the students, when they were interviewed about the programme, said, actually, no, we don't want one computer each. It's much better for us to work in groups because we learn from each other if we work in groups, and students suggested groups of anything from 3 to 5 as being optimal. Limited evidence around computer-assisted learning in mathematics. I don't know why mathematics and not any other subjects, but this was not as a replacement for other lessons, but as a supplement, either for disadvantaged students or students who are perceived to be underperforming, and there seemed to be some benefit as a kind of remedial or supplementary programme for computer-assisted learning in mathematics, and a few papers that evidence that. So, in summary, we think an awful lot more needs to be known about how to support and enable teachers to introduce change in their practice. That was something that wasn't spoken to very much in many of the papers. What was it that was done that enabled the teachers to introduce the change where those changes were seen? And we need to know a lot more about how those practices are enacted. What actually happens in the classroom when teachers take these technologies and use them? How does that change the nature of what's going on? And we're going to come back to those in a minute, because I think now we've got a video of Niall talking about the discussion.
And I'd like to start off with a quote from UNESCO, because I think it covers a number of them. And the quote is, "Technology can be a powerful educational multiplier, but we must know how to use it. It is not enough to install technologies into classrooms. It must be integrated into learning. Nothing can substitute for a good teacher." And the first point there, installing technologies into classrooms, I think it's good that we don't start with a technocentric perspective. So while it's good to know about teachers' use of technology day to day, that's only a starting point. And you'll see there's lots of work in the report, reference in the report, that looks at teachers' technical literacies. But we need to now go further. We need to think about how they use technology in their pedagogical practice, so in their teaching practice. And this, essentially how it can be integrated into learning, as the quote says. And we can do that in two ways. One is to think about subject-specific pedagogies, and Tom's example in the paper about communicative language teaching. So thinking about a very particular pedagogy, in this case in learning English, how can technology, or how can the technology intervention be designed that leverages that pedagogy in support of language learning? So not just thinking about integrating the technology into the classroom in a abstract sense, but really thinking about the practice and focusing on the practice. The second point is, in order to do that, you need to really understand the affordances or the functionalities of the technologies you're using, phones, tablets, laptops, etc. And think about how they support new ways of learning. So if, for example, if a Minister of Education comes to you and says, I can use pen and paper to do that, why should I spend all this money on technology? You need to have a good answer. And some of the most successful edtech tools are ones that use new representations that allow learners to understand concepts or give ways into concepts in new ways that traditional methods based on pen and paper do not. So that's a good justification for use. Third point is a conceptual one, and I'll just talk about it very briefly. You can have a broader discussion later on. Is a slight critique of the work we came across is that a number of projects weren't as explicit as they should be about the learning theory underpinning their work. So being clearer conceptually about where they're coming from and how that relates to a tradition or a particular tradition of educational research. And you can find about a lot more of that in the paper. Two final points, as I think you'd expect. One is the focus on teacher training, and a strong focus on teacher training that moves us beyond competencies and technical literacies, but actually ongoing support over time for changing pedagogical practices. And the final one is on generating evidence. Okay, what counts as evidence and how do we generate it?
In terms of education advisors, we think that we should be promoting programs and proposals that either further develop practices that have already been shown to be successful, and the kind of things we've been talking about, the IRI, the mobile technologies for the teachers' use, the learners using e-readers and things like that, or that address gaps in our knowledge. So how do you better support teachers to enable those sort of changes? What kind of new innovations might there be? We think advisors should discourage proposals that emphasise technology over education or give weak programmatic support to teachers or poor evaluation. And the final area is that we think that there needs to be much more work done in terms of developing value for money metrics and thinking about the ways in which we approach cost effectiveness evaluation. Thank you.
Okay, I've got the pleasure to introduce you to our three distinguished panellists. First of all, Dr. David Hollow, who is a director of Jigsaw Consult. And a lot of your work, David, is involved in the evaluation side of things. So I think you may have something to say to some of the questions that we had earlier. And a lot of experience in terms of the use of ICT in education in Africa particularly. We have Gary Motteram, Dr. Gary Motteram, who's a senior lecturer in the University of Manchester. His background, he tells me, is very much around English language teaching and learning, and that's very much where he has worked in for a number of years. I'm not going to say how many. But more recently has become involved perhaps with some of the techniques you developed in maybe OECD countries to developing countries. So he brings both perspectives. And finally, Professor Emeritus, is that how you pronounce it, Robert? Robert McCormick, who started off as a teacher of physics, but is now and has been working for the Open University for a number of years, looking at teacher education and associated research, and has been involved, I understand, in our English in Action programme. So thank you very much for coming and for travelling over. And how we're going to ask a set of questions around sort of three areas, and then, as I said, we'll open it up to the audience. First of all, we're going to look at this area of programme design, and we'll try and do this as much as a conversation as possible, but we'll see how it goes. The first sort of question that we have and we'd like to find out more about is priorities around design, the use of education technology for teaching and learning to raise learning outcomes. In your experience over the years in terms of being involved in programs, particularly perhaps if that's all right with you to share maybe some of the mistakes we've made in the past, I think it'd be helpful for us just to kick off and looking about sort of key areas about effective programming that we know given the evidence today. So David, can I kick off with you, giving your background and evaluation, sure, and then we'll move forward with the other panelists. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks Sally. I think a huge topic, and we could say a lot of different things. I guess to have something very practical at the outset, from our experience working many different countries, lots of different schools, it's striking how often educational leadership, the role of the head teacher, is forgotten when introducing an educational technology program. For whatever reason, and there are many, often governments or donors will bypass educational leadership and try and go straight to teachers and straight to students. And we found that one way of ensuring that the integration of technology in education is much more likely to succeed is if there is an intentional, explicit focus from the outset on ensuring that we're winning the hearts and the minds of the head teachers as well as the teachers. And there's lots of reasons for that I'm sure you can appreciate, but I think that would be one practical thing. And that feeds into the larger issue around what Tom mentioned at the outset regarding the emphasis on deployment as opposed to integration. I think we've been saying it, people have been saying it in research and practitioners for the last decade, and I think we are seeing progress, but if 5 years ago maybe there was, within a programme budget, you might have 80% of the time and energy and resources going into deployment and 20% going into integration. Your ideal situation to instigate genuine educational transformation would be 20% of the time and the money going into deployment, and then 80% going into what do we actually do to change the culture of the classroom, integrate with the curriculum in order that we can see this long-term educational change take place. So maybe the two things for me.
David, just for those of us who are less familiar with this area, can you describe what you mean exactly by deployment? Is that defined?
Sure. Deployment being
Just buying.
getting whatever technology you hope to introduce from a warehouse into a classroom so that it's working in the anticipated manner.
Okay.
So
That's quite
that
shocking.
inevitably keeps people preoccupied for the first few months of the programme. Then once you've got that, often you realise that not many people have really thought about what we're going to do now it's all in place. Which is often exacerbated by the fact that lots of input indicators within evaluation structures will be based on how many devices did we deploy. Did we get them in the classroom? Yes. Fantastic, that's a tick. That's the beginning rather than the end.
Great. Well, it's a useful practical tip for DFID long frames on these programmes, so thank you. Gary.
I mean, pick up on that. I mean, we see that anywhere. I mean, it's not just about in development projects. I mean, if you look back to the very early stages of introducing technology into schools in the UK, I mean, that was very much the case, without delivery. I mean, I also think, I mean, as well as head teachers, and we often ignore anybody in the school. We ignore the teachers, particularly the teachers. And we often downplay teachers in a big way, and we often ignore what student needs are and student interests are in use of technology. I mean, one of the things that I would advocate is actually starting within the school, looking at what the school has before you even begin to think about what technology you might employ or what ways that you're going to implement technology, just to see what actually is happening. I mean, I've got sort of. And I was thinking about this. I mean, I was thinking about, you start with the needs of the participants, whoever they are. You look at local conditions. You work within what's actually within the local context. A very important thing, particularly in language teaching, I'm sure it must be true in other subjects as well, making sure that what your learning outcomes and your assessment are aligned very much. I mean, that's something that comes out of the higher education literature as a reference. But I mean, I see it so often. You introduce a new pedagogy, a new methodological approach into a school or into an education authority, introduces that, and then the exams stay the same. So it's very true in language teaching. We have communicative language teaching, which has already been mentioned. It's introduced, countrywide. The textbooks are new, but the exams are still grammar translation, and I think that's probably true in many subjects, particularly an important aspect of languages. And coming back to the teacher, let's not ignore the teacher. Bring the teacher along. Give them a bit of space, to actually do things, recognising that a new innovation takes them time to actually implement stuff as well. So, I mean, I think we so often forget the teacher. We denigrate the teacher rather too much in these processes, not just with technology, but generally when we're looking at change in education.
Yeah, I've got some things to say about that kind of thing, but I'd like to pick up the point back about the future. What happened in European countries and America is that we broke our neck to try to get schools to do better on the use of technologies for a long time, and that's been true from audio through video through computing. And actually, as soon as it becomes ubiquitous in society, it then has a real impact in schools. So videotape recorders. Video was never used until you could buy them for next to nothing and put it in the school, and people knew how to use it. Same thing happened with computers. Now people probably wouldn't talk so much about the use of it. And I think when it gets to the point of being ubiquitous and leading edge, and it's moving, and that was the point I think that was made at the back, and that makes it really quite difficult to think about futures when you're doing it now. So I think we ought to puzzle a bit about that and think about timescales over which these things are happening, because many of the developing countries have very big ideas about where they want to be. And because I work in Rwanda, for example, the knowledge economy is really important, and what happens in ICT in general in the society is almost more important than what happens in schools. And that's true in the UK, because Bob Moon used to do the figure you've just spoken there about, the time you spend in schools on a machine compared with what you do at home is just negligible. And then it becomes integrated. I don't know what the answer to that is, but I think we have to puzzle about that. Now, taking that aside, going back to simple advice, then I think first of all, you have to think about teachers' use of the technology quite differently from student use of it. And I think that's worth just separating those two issues out. There is an overlap, but some of the stuff that Tom's talked about in relation to EIA, which he and I know well, are about what teachers do with technology, and nothing much to do with students in that case. There is an overlap, but that's the thing. But if we are talking about students, then I think we just take some simple things about getting good quality material in the hands of students. That's also true for teachers. And that's one of the good things that ICT brings, is the technology brings. It puts the real good stuff in the hand of the learner, whether it's a teacher or a student, and doesn't have it going through many layers until it's been mutated so much. And I think that's quite important. And then just some simple things about the nature of activities. And I take the point that, I can't remember, somebody made a point about subject-based, and I think that's a very missing point. The subject-based pedagogy is also important, and I just add one thing to that, which is we don't think enough about, and especially in developing context, if scientists are using computers to do data analysis, that's what we should try to get kids to do, because that will tell them about science that's happening. We don't think much about computers as used by the front edge things. You take all this stuff that's happening at the moment about the comet and so on. Data's coming back, and we know that mass analysis is happening all around the world by kids being able to download and look at data, or adults, and do real analysis. That's what real science is about. So I think that might be worth also thinking about. What's the role of computing in the subject, not just as a way of dealing with pedagogy as an abstraction, because that's often the problem. So I'd like to get more thoughts on that. I think that's probably enough.
Great, thank you. There's some great topics there. David, do you want to come in on any of those points?
I just wanted to say something about the textbook. I mean, we've been obsessed by textbooks for an awfully long period of time, and we don't really have any data on whether they're effective in schools, do we? And actually, what they do, in a sense, is they do exactly what you're saying. They synthesize down ideas into something that isn't really the way that we do things in the real world. And there are lots of ideas about how you might do that. And I think that's a really important point, that actually getting people to do that stuff. I think that's much more difficult in the developing world, but the idea then of delivering content, sort of real material that people can play with. So if you can't deliver it over the internet, you can provide it in a format like you do on the EIA project. So people have stuff that they can do things with in the classroom, and you can do that even with very low tech mobile phones, for example. And I mean, it's Rhonda here. Rhonda, and you talk about the World Reader project, but that sounds a very innovative way of actually delivering material so that people can actually do real things with quite low tech resources in the classroom. So I think just picking up on what you're saying.
David, do you want anything to add?
Yeah, one quick thing. I think it's been mentioned already, but the focus of our discussion is how educational technology can be used to make a difference for the most marginalised. And the inevitable consequence of that is when we're interacting with teachers in the most marginalised location, the level of pre-existing capacity for using ICT is minimal on the whole. And whereas a few years ago, one of the dominant narratives within the educational technology space was technology can be used to bypass teachers, and then we can get just pure constructivist learning. Thankfully, that has moved out of the mainstream now, and teachers are being re-centralised. However, there is still an assumption that teachers can learn very quickly, and I think one of the things that we will need to make progress on, again, if we're going to see the change for the most marginalised, is not just talking about the importance of teacher training, but saying we recognise that teacher training is going to take a very long time, because we're not just training people how to use technology, we're actually training people as part of a holistic change programme, how technology can be part of them being a whole new type of teacher. And that's not easy, that takes a long time. It takes a long time for any of us, and we are all using technology every day. So I think if we want to see that, then the programs that we've seen most effective, again, it goes back to the 80-20 principle, are those programs which actually say we're committed, even though we might not have as many end beneficiaries, we're committed to investing the resource to have someone who is trained walking with a school, in the school 5 days a week for at least the first year of this journey, so that the teachers can go step by step on that journey. Otherwise, we get a recurring situation like Tom referenced in many of the research studies, where over time, gradually, the teachers just slip back into pre-intervention habits because there's no one there who can actually take them on the journey through to the point when they're independent, confident users of the technology.
Great, thank you. And that's give a good move into the next question. But this is bringing back really scary memories for me of training to be a teacher 20 years ago. And the most frightening part was sitting in a computer lab with all these kids knowing more about the computers than I did, and suddenly having to completely think about what the role of a teacher was going to be. So it's good to have a carpeted approach.
It's interesting, and just to the question about whole school approaches. I mean, I think that's a way of certainly looking at this issue of trying to build a community of teachers so that they're not independent. We have this vision of a teacher in a school, a teacher in a classroom on their own with a group of kids. What you should be doing again. There was again a question about connecting teachers together, and that's certainly something that's really important. It's trying to look at ways, as well as delivering content for use in classroom, actually trying to find ways of connecting teachers together. And you can do that again in really quite low-tech ways in different contexts. So I think some of the projects I've been involved in or working on at the moment, again looking at ways of making sure that teachers talk to each other and work together in that kind of effective way. And I think that helps to. Do people heard of Sugata Mitra? He won a massive prize. Got £1 million to spend on doing things, and he stands up in public on a regular process to say teachers don't really matter. So it's an unfortunate sort of situation, really, to sort of find yourselves in that kind of space. But he has evidence, he has research evidence to suggest that that's sort of the case. But at the same time, we're saying that teachers are important. I think we have to think about the impact that those kinds of developments, those kinds of things that happen in the bigger world actually impact on what we do in development.
Great, thank you. I wanted to try and, we can talk, I know, we'll come back to it. But I think I'm really keen on focusing us down on this area of marginalisation, because I think that's the real key challenge for us at DFID and more broadly, because there's a lot of, as we said, interesting innovation in this area. We're learning much more in a context, as you, I think, really, was well put, this issue about society in general being embedded with technology, and then how that then makes it so much easier to introduce it into classroom practice. But as lots of the contexts we're trying to introduce this technology into, that isn't the case. And I just want to throw in as well, and maybe for the audience too later, this issue about the use of technology also in sort of humanitarian conflict contexts, where the actual, the idea of building a school and training teachers is just so far down the track that this is a real challenge in the development community, I think, to really think much more creatively about how we can use technology. But that's a bit of a bugbear of mine, so we can come back to that later. David, do you want to say a little bit more about this whole issue about equity and technology, and then we'll come on to Bob and Gary.
Sure. I think, as you say, there's an inherent tension because the most marginalised are normally, although not exclusively, in remote rural regions, and we have any technology intervention, as with any mainstream intervention, but just exacerbated, has a tendency to want to be close to the areas where deployment can happen quickly, and we can visit the project, and it's easy to monitor that. So I think there is a tension there, and in some of the projects that we're involved with, you have to have a trade-off, because the most marginalised are not in a place where, at the moment, these initiatives can actually benefit. But I think what we found, I was in a remote region of northern Ghana a few months ago, and there we were working with a formal computer lab-based intervention. But in terms of reaching the most marginalised, what was actually having the biggest impact was the fact that the teachers were using their smartphones and they were going into the town and they were using their cheap access to the internet to download resources for how they could improve their early child development techniques. And although that was not part of the evaluation we were conducting, it was clear that that was what was having most transformative impact within the school for these marginalised children. It was the fact that the good quality teachers were joining the dots for themselves because they realised what they could achieve when they had a smartphone and they could access the type of resources. So I think there's something there for us thinking about. Once there is connectivity, then it's about guiding people, or at least providing a framework for people where they can actually find the resources that they want for themselves outside of any formal donor-led intervention. That's one thing.
Thanks, David. Bob?
Well, yes, that's an interesting example, because I just wrote down when you said that, stay away from computers if you want to deal with the rural areas, because especially if you want to then think about internet connections and so on. And it may be better actually to start with a rural area and just say, what will we do in those remote schools, small remote schools, and say that's the solution. If it works there, it'll work anywhere. Whereas actually the opposite happens in, there's a couple of projects in Rwanda that I'm involved with, and they're starting in colleges where it's best, and it's still falling over all the time, even there. They've got a few secondary schools got it, and these are in the midst of programs where, in theory, they've rolled out computers to all of these secondary schools. And we know that even in Kigali, one of the secondary schools doesn't have electricity. And so I think it may be better to start with that area and then work backwards as a kind of light. And my inclination would be to start with mobile phones and SD cards, so that you can skip some of the issues on connectivity, which are going to be a problem wherever you are, because you can use solar cells if you don't do it. But most of these people find ways of charging these phones because they're ubiquitous. So that's what I think I would go for if we wanted a simple. It's rather simple-minded, but it actually might be a good way to start rather than going much further. Or you can do what Tom has done in the past, which is to go into really remote areas with very leading-edge stuff, and let's see what teachers can do with it in those situations. But how you scale up is the issue, and people don't think about scale up until too late, and you need to start with scale, and that's why I would think about that in rural areas.
Great, thank you, Gary.
I mean, just extending that, I mean, for me, I think you're starting off by looking at what people already have. So instead of thinking about, well, what technology am I going to bring with me on this project, what are people already using? The project I'm working on in Pakistan at the moment, I can sort of talk about a number of connections, if you like, in my own head, some of which are connected to English in Action, some to other projects that have been mentioned as well. You find in quite remote areas, you find a secondary school that does have a computer lab that occasionally has some connectivity. And you can use a simple tool like Skype, a piece of video conferencing software, and you can connect teacher groups. And what we're doing here at the moment is we're just experimenting with connecting British Council teachers in the offices in Lahore to resource centres where teachers come from the small towns and villages to gather once a month to do administrative tasks, to do some kind of teacher education. So as part of that process, a number of content resources have been set up, and I'm actually beginning to think, well, maybe we should deliver some of that on mobile phones or simple cheap tablets or whatever in a way. But there are a number of resources. But what we then do is work with the teachers remotely, sort of one person to many in doing that. And that idea partly came from work that's done, the one laptop per child project in Chile that's called Plan Cebal, is a project where they've introduced that kind of technology to the classroom. But they've also been and that's not seemed to work very effectively, but an adjunct to that, which is a British Council project, actually uses quite high-tech video connectivity, and it brings teachers into the classroom from other parts of the world. So instead of it happening in terms of trying to ship loads of teacher trainers out to do this, they actually bring teachers directly into the classroom through video conferencing. They don't just act as an external teacher, they work quite creatively with the local teachers. So it's part of an ongoing training project to try and upscale the language skills of these teachers. And so it's using a sort of a range of technologies. So the Pakistan project is doing that in a kind of more low-tech way, which has its issues. And actually, I was in Germany recently. You wouldn't think of Germany as being a low-tech country, would you? In Magdeburg, which is not so far from Berlin. And they were doing a very similar project with Skype. It was much more involved a blended approach where the teachers also came to the UK for kind of the language training. But the core was simple teacher-to-teacher working online once a week, actually just giving them the confidence in their language skills, developing their skills, but also at the same time developing their ICT skills as well. So, you can see similar sorts of projects. We're talking about the clickability. It's possible to do that, I think, in a number of different contexts, using a range of different technology. But I think the key thing for me is look what's there first, and then try and build on that. And if you want to add in other technologies to spread, so if some teachers don't have any access to any kind of mobile technology, then you can actually provide that for them. So that gets around the kind of social justice and marginalisation sort of side of things as well.
Great, thank you. I'm quite conscious of time because I want us to have opportunity to open this up, but if I could just ask the panellists just to focus just on the final set of questions, which is around what our priorities should be in terms of monitoring and evaluation, and if you could keep it fairly short, that would be great, because then we can open it up. And please just keep all those questions you have about design and marginalisation just in the back of your mind, so we can bring those topic areas back in our conversation later. Bob, do you want to kick us off on this one?
Well, I mean, the research shows we just need more of it, although I'm mindful of the comment that was just made at the back there again about, we do the research on yesterday's technologies. So, and I don't know what the way out of that is, but if we still do the research on yesterday's technologies, I think, Nikki, I would take an issue with you about whether we should be theory-led in relation to it. Because I was interested, you said that we want a better psychological theory, and I immediately said, no, I have a different one, mine's a social cultural one. And that's where, for example, if you look at the Westbrook research on the use of supporting CPD and so on, one of the things they found the difficulty of in looking at qualitative studies is that they all had a theoretically different perspective, and you couldn't compare any of the findings. So that I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't go for something that's theory-driven from the point of view of grand theory is what I call it. You may not have meant that, but just let me...
Yeah, just to qualify, I didn't say it should be theory-driven. What I said is that research should inform theoretical understanding of how things are.
Well, I think I would even say no to that, if I may. And that's because I would much rather we dropped a level to the mechanisms and that we simply looked at, I think Tom said at one stage, what's the connection between changes in classroom behaviour and learning outcomes. Whatever the theoretical things, but just to look at some of those. And I'd call those just the explanations of the outcomes. And it's at a mechanism level. It may be just the classroom, it may be the interaction, and that's one of the difficulties, the interaction at the interface level between a student and the machine, the technology. And that's a really hard area to do research on.
Great. Okay, I'm just going to put that thought there, sorry, because I just really want to make sure we've got time for other people as well. David, do you want to come in with your...
Sure. Yeah, plenty we can talk about. I think, as we said, it's a very fast-moving space, and the risk is that we have such rigorous research that comes out 2 years after it's of use to anybody. And I think there's improvement for us in terms of iterative design and short learning cycles, so that programs are implemented in a way where the feedback loop is much shorter than it is in conventional academic circles. And there's obviously a place for both types of research, but I think we need much more emphasis, as was suggested, in shrinking the learning cycle. I think it's important to be explicit at the outset regarding what type of study this is. if this is primarily about innovation and learning, then it can have scope for far more. What we see, unfortunately, is often when a study starts out with very clear sets of objectives that it doesn't reach, it then repackages its narrative as this is a learning exercise, which is obvious. There's good reasons for that, but I think we need to be clear at the outset regarding what type of study this is, and then see that through to conclusion. I think it's important to remember that the ICT and education space is no different from anywhere else in terms of the rigour of monitoring and evaluation, and that is something which is improving gradually, but you see a lot of studies which were mentioned where no one thought at the beginning about having a suitably rigorous control group in place. Lots of incredible claims made about the impact of technology without any real clear attribution analysis, and you could go on. And I think the important thing is to track over time in terms of learning outcomes, not just after the first 8 weeks, which we always see an improvement after 6 to 8 weeks because everyone gets excited about the technology being in place. Children come to school more, there's lots of different ways to get children to come to school, then temporarily their learning outcomes will improve, but when you go back a year later, actually it's just reverted to type. So we need to introduce the rigour into the more longitudinal studies as well, and I think some of the work that the 1 billion are doing with the randomised control trials in Malawi that hopefully we'll hear about is actually taking us forward with that. And it's interesting how fast the space moves, that a study is produced on the basis of research that was carried out a year ago, and already in the room there's 3 or 4 studies that can take us beyond that. So I think it's quite an exciting situation to be in, but certainly one where we can use the rigour from elsewhere and actually not just make excuses for the fact that this is innovative and learning. We can still actually use best practice.
Great, thanks David. And Gary, just a final comment.
I'll be very quick. I mean, I think we ought to think very hard about the way that teachers can be involved, or even kids can be involved in actually helping us to support research in that kind of way. And that also helps to do the kind of things that you were talking about, so doing real things in the classroom with it. And we also, I think we miss a trick in terms of the technology. Technology can gather data for us as well. So if we've got basic mobile phones, we can send out simple questionnaires and collect data kind of very quickly. That enables us to actually get something out of the context very easily, so that we're not waiting a long time for people to track out, collect data, and come back with it and then analyse it. So those kinds of things.
Thank you, and we could spend a lot more time. Sorry, it has been so short.